Okie dokie, there we go. So welcome everyone to tonight's talk. We've got Anne Beck here with us. Thank you so much, Anne, for spending some of your time with us this evening. Anne has spent an incredible 26 years volunteering with the charity Children of Chernobyl, which is a fantastic organisation that helps children and, of course, their families as well, that have come out of an incredible disaster that happened almost a long time ago, but the effects of which are still being held very much today. So before we let Anne entrap us with her tales of history this evening, she's asked if I can show a little video first, just a short 5-minute clip that will set up this talk quite nicely. So Anne and I are going to mute our microphones and our videos now. We'll show a little video and then we'll get on with the talk. So I shall invite you all to enjoy.
To think I might not see those eyes makes it so hard not to cry. And as we say,
sorry everyone, apologies, I've just realised there's no sound, is there? Bear with me just 1 second. Right.
goodbyes, I nearly do. Light up, as if you have a choice, even if you cannot hear my voice. I'll be right beside you, dear.
I cannot see you, but I'm looking at you. I cannot feel you, but I'm touching you. I cannot smell you, but I'm breathing you. I know who you are because my mama told me so. Your name is radiation, and you are everywhere I go.
So an emotional story there in just 5 minutes. But now for the full story, we're going to hand over to Anne, who's going to give us a proper history of the children of Chernobyl. Over to you, Anne. Thanks so much for coming this evening.
Thank you very much. And I'd just firstly like to say thank you very much for inviting me. I feel very honoured to be able to talk to you. I am slightly nervous, so please bear with me. I'm not speaking to this presentation tonight from a position of expertise on radiation. My expertise comes from working with these children and the people of Belarus, particularly over the last 26 years, in helping to try to bring radiation damaged children from Belarus and the Ukraine to the UK for just respite care. It's about getting them out of the radiation and giving them the opportunity to eat clean food, breathe fresh air, and to build memories that they can take back. Many of you will remember the Chernobyl disaster of April 1986. In fact, there's been a very good refresher for us all in the Sky drama, which I presume many of you have watched. It was, I can tell you, extremely factual. I also had the honour to be able to speak to some of the cast who wanted to speak to somebody who had been involved in a more positive side of Chernobyl, if there is one, I have to say. But apparently the cast had been extremely affected by the trauma that they had had to take on board to be able to fill their roles in this in the drama. And so it was very interesting to talk to them. I'm talking tonight really about, I'm going to give a few facts about the disaster itself, just as a quick refresher. And then really tonight I'm going to talk about the latest book, which Kate Brown has written. She's a professor of science in Massachusetts, and she's uncovered some really incredible facts. So without further ado, I'll continue. So, as many of you know, this was a...
Sorry, Anne, just to interrupt you. Yeah. Do we need to get your PowerPoint up first?
Oh, I've got it up. So
yeah, your screen isn't on sharing at the moment.
Right, so let's try again. Sorry.
No, you're okay.
Let's try again. Have you
there
got
we
it
go.
now?
You're away.
Sorry.
No, you're okay. Thanks very much.
Just trying to... That's it. This was an RBMK reactor. It was a water-cooled reactor that sat in the Ukraine, which was 50 miles west of Belarus, of the border of Belarus. Unfortunately, the International Atomic Energy Agency understood that in these water-cooled reactors, there was an inherent design fault. And the design fault was simply that if all the fuel rods were dropped together to cool the reactor, for a nanosecond, the core would heat up just for a nanosecond. But it was an inherent fault, and it was felt to be a bullet. So many of the water-cooled reactors were closed down around the world. But unfortunately, we're talking the Soviet Union here, and this information never really trickled down through the bureaucracy that existed at the time. We also have to place it in the context of the fact that in 1986, the world, to a degree, and particularly the superpowers, were in a power race. Power and energy was seen to be core to economic survival and economic power. So these nuclear seemed to fill that gap and allowed us to create power more cheaply. So there was a routine, this was an accident, it was a routine maintenance test that was programmed to take place at 12 o'clock in April 1986. The engineers on site realised that the reactor was running very high, very hot, and it was discussed that this test should not take place. But unfortunately, this was the Soviet Union, and nobody had the, well, they weren't brave enough, and you can understand why if you know anything about the Soviet Union, to disobey the order. That test had to take place, so they did it. And within seconds, the building blew up. The debris, as you can see, went 9 kilometres into the air. A lot of the waste fell on site. Two people were killed instantly. But the problem was the radioactive cloud travelled because the wind was going west, which was why that radioactive cloud travelled all over Europe. You can see there that cesium-137 contaminated 40% of Europe, and it got as far, I'll show you a map a bit later, but we still have 374 farms on the east side, on the west side of the UK that are still restricted for food. There was 400% more radioactive fallout than was delivered to Hiroshima, but 60% of that fallout fell on Belarus. They were a farming nation. They're very forested. It's a very beautiful country. They had very little. They were typical Soviet Union at the time, and that's why agriculture was one of their main lifelines, really. 336,000 people were evacuated. They weren't evacuated, however, for 3 days. Surrounding the power plant was a town called Pripyat, which was built specially for the nuclear power station. Of course, people in the Ukraine didn't understand that nuclear was as dangerous as it was. They thought this was a new beginning, a new start, and they were built this new town with everything that went with it. It was a luxury lifestyle for them. However, they were just told by loudspeaker to stay indoors. But on the first night, they all went out to find out what exactly had happened. 9 million people live on the contaminated areas, and 750,000 children were guessed to have been affected. Estimated probably would be a better word. There was following the explosion, there was a 40% increase in leukemia, and genetic mutations still occur where food and water and soil are contaminated. The morbidity rate increased in those 10 years, 1990 to 2000, by 40%. And they still know today that 90% of children suffer health issues directly attributed to radiation. That's mainly due to the major elements that were found in the radioactive fallout: the iodine, the cesium, and the strontium. A lot of that presents itself, of course, with thyroid cancer, cancers, particularly bone disorders, cataracts, eye and vessel, and cardio disabilities. We all know about Marie Curie, and we all know about the wonderful work she did. Thank heavens she did. But as you know, she died from anemia after years of exposure to radiation through her work. But one of the most interesting facts is that some of her papers were bought by Japanese collectors, and they're in the Tokyo Library. And 70 years later, in 2004, when they were Geiger counted, her fingerprints were still radioactive. And I suppose that brings me on to talk about how long will Belarus and the Ukraine be radioactive. Well, the estimate is certain areas of it will be radioactive for 24,000 years. The half-life is the rate that radiation decays, and it decays at different levels. Once it reaches its half-life, it decays slower, and then subsequently slower again, and subsequently slower again. So iodine, which is what caused a lot of the thyroid cancers, actually only has a half-life of 8 days. And that's why we saw the spike in thyroid cancer at the beginning, but not so much now. Cesium-137, which is another major issue, has a half-life of 30 years, and strontium-90 the same. But there were other elements that were found. Belarus was, in a way, well, Chernobyl was a sort of world awakening, really. I listened to a scientist at a conference who said, we all knew about the effects of Nagasaki, about the effects of fallout. We'd all done nuclear testing, atom bomb testing. What the world had never seen was the problems associated with the with the actual living with radiation, long-term exposure to radiation. So they also found that out of the radiation, that about 12 new elements were found. But the half-life of some of the elements in that radiation, such as iodine-129, has a half-life of 15.7 million years, and uranium-235 of 703 million years. And I think that is what is so frightening about nuclear. So this is the Kate Brown book. There are lots of, well, not lots, but there are several books on Chernobyl. The ones that really have talked about the disaster itself and about how it was allowed to happen. So the ethos of the Soviet people, the bureaucracy of communism. But for the first time, Kate Brown wrote this book about a Chernobyl Guide to the Future. And she had spent years researching some documentation across some of Europe, including ourselves, the US in particular. So these were papers that had now been declassified. But better still, she had access to the Soviet papers, some Soviet papers, particularly in Belarus and Ukraine, post perestroika, the breakdown of the Soviet Union. So she focused on the consequences of radioactivity and it bursting into the atmosphere, why we've not learned more lessons, the heroism of some of the people, and about the victims that the Kremlin don't want us to know about. Their strategy was only admit what cannot be denied. But one of the key things that she focused on is why was everything hushed up. Here you can see we're talking about lawsuits here from some of the early atomic bomb production and testing, which we were all involved in. This wasn't just a US thing, but the US were facing lawsuits very early on. We were in this energy race, we were all in this energy race, and nobody wanted bad press. So it wasn't only the fact that they had all these lawsuits, but there was this moral obligation of exposing millions of people. In 1959, which is very early on, which is where we were starting to work with some of this testing, there was an agreement formed between the International Atomic Energy Agency, which governs nuclear, the World Health Organization, and the International Atomic Energy. And what it agreed was that the International Atomic Energy Agency would have the last veto of any information released about nuclear via the World Health Organization. And today, that agreement still stands. That is to ensure that we have monitored information, that we don't all end up, I suppose, fearing nuclear beyond belief. As I said before, in the UK, every fourth time we switch on our kettle, it's powered by nuclear. And we have to remember that. Unfortunately, at the moment, we need it. So scientists were encouraged to play down the long-term exposure. but in the USSR, the KGB played an active part in suppressing any damaging information. Kate Brown also uncovered the fact that the Russians were advised that any livestock needed to be killed and buried. But in the economic situation that Russia found itself in, especially knowing that they'd got this massive cost of the Chernobyl disaster, they chose not to do that. They actually distributed a lot of the radioactive meat across the USSR. It's even worse than that to a degree, because even Europe took radioactive berries. They have been distributed for years so that their damage is diffused. In the case of that Kate Brown identified, she actually found that in a wool factory in northern Ukraine, they were expected to continue to clean fleeces from dead sheep. But unfortunately, these fleeces were highly contaminated, and 200 people were classified as liquidators. So many of those would have received a pension. You had to suffer massive radiation damage to be classed as a liquidator. And for that, you got a small pension, many of whom now have died. There was also the case of a lorry that was crossing from the US to Canada only 4 years ago, and it sparked an alert, a radiation alert. They thought it was a dirty bomb, but when they opened the lorry, actually it was blueberries from the Ukraine. So we still have the contaminated food crossing borders. Scientists at first believed that the explosion mirrored what happened with an atomic bomb, and therefore they ignored the long-term exposure. And it was a KGB general who actually, in studying 2,000 people, realised that that wasn't the case, that being exposed to radiation was far more dangerous, unless, you know, obviously if you were close to an atomic bomb like in Nagasaki, we all know what happened there. But being long-term exposure, we knew nothing about. But in the Soviet Union, he was jailed for 8 years for bringing that evidence to the fore, and all evidence to it was destroyed. One of the other things that was found was the fact that Moscow needed to protect itself and its key areas. So they actually changed the weather. They took moisture out of the clouds by dropping cement with reagents to create a drought of 5 months so that it didn't rain radiation dust on Moscow or key areas of Russia. But at the same time, they seeded clouds with silver iodine to make it rain. And unfortunately, it had to rain on Belarus, which was why Belarus took 60% of the fallout. And to a degree, because it fell quite heavily in Belarus, it probably didn't affect Europe as much as it could have done. The Belarusians, of course, were not told anything about well, nobody knew about this. It's only recently come out. In 1988, the scientists believed that the radiation should lessen, would get less. But as you can see from these statistics, that wasn't the case. So 98% of milk was over permissible levels, even in 1986. And these, when they're foraging, these are a farming nation. They were used to foraging. If you see the beautiful forests with the beautiful berries and the beautiful mushrooms, these were people who just went into the forest and picked the berries and picked the mushrooms. But as you can see here, only one forest had uncontaminated mushrooms. He was imprisoned for actually speaking out about that information. So in 1996, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health organisation, and UNSCEAR. UNSCEAR was a United Nations scientific committee set up to look at the effects of atomic radiation. And they had to admit that their models had failed post-Chernobyl and needed to be rewritten. The Ukraine paid compensation to over 35 people whose spouses died, but this comes back to being whether you were named as a liquidator or not. So it was very hard to get liquidator status because it gave this very small derisory pension. It is hard, I suppose, to, in Kate Brown's book, what she clearly shows is that because we were now in Soviet Russia, it was very, very hard to collate information because it was, the organisation was built up very much like individual organisations, so polit areas that had their own commander who reported back to Moscow. But none of the information was ever collated nationally. So to get figures on the numbers that were affected by Chernobyl in any way will never happen because much of the evidence was destroyed anyway. Dr. Bandakeski confirmed life expectancy was cut by 10 to 15 years for Belarusians and the Ukrainians. So what was the cost? The estimated cost of the cleanup was 235 billion. But at the time, the cleanup was sporadic. They didn't know how to deal with it. They washed down buildings. They wore face masks, but not full gear. They believed that if they washed it into the ground, it would go away. They had to, when they did the cleanup of the site, all the equipment that was used, there's 100 acres of equipment, helicopters, bulldozers, all those sort of things that just are sat idle and can't be touched because they are so radioactive. Of course, many believe that this was this caused the breakup of the USSR. It actually changed people's mindsets. It showed people that perhaps communism didn't work. So the experts believe that the Chernobyl disaster was actually the catalyst that formed the breakdown of the USSR. The cost to humans, well, we have got some figures, but it's very unknown. This was the radioactive fallout from cesium-137 after Chernobyl. And you can see the areas in the UK clearly that were affected. When I went to the conference that talked about this map, they showed a headline from Le Monde, the national newspaper in France, that clearly stated that the French government said that no fallout had fallen on France. But as you can clearly see by this map, this scientific map, that wasn't the case. So the direct casualties, so 31 people died in 3 months of radiation poisoning. Of course, it was a terrible death. Of course, they were exposed and to massive amounts of radiation. When the liquidators were working on the roof, they could only do 1 to 2 minutes, and they had to be fully suited with lead boots and full gear. But they realised they couldn't even get off the steps to do their 1 to 2 minutes, so many of them didn't wear them and just ran. 134 emergency workers suffer from acute radiation sickness, and 25 rescue workers died since then of the disease caused by radiation. There are all the statistics on the birth defects, miscarriages and stillbirths. The Guardian also ran I have got the name of the guy who also did, the professor who did a a research paper on the fact that just after Chernobyl, there was a massive spike in stillbirths in the UK in the areas that were contaminated. But again, very little publicity has been given to it. And this is partly due to that formed agreement with the World Health Organization. By the year 2000, there were 800 cases of thyroid cancer in children and adolescents. Of course, children at puberty were the worst hit. I think that's medically because of the way their hormones were. So all children, but of course, the problem was when Fukushima happened in Japan, people were given iodine tablets and they were asked to stay indoors. But because the Soviet Union was trying to keep it a secret, which they did, as you know, for several days, nobody was told not to, except those in Pripyat, not to go out. And they weren't issued with iodine tablets. Now, part of the reason they didn't let it be known was for the first 2 days, they didn't actually know that the core had melted. They believed it was only the building. So somebody had to crawl over the roof and actually look into the core to find out that it was on fire. So for 2 days, Moscow didn't actually know that the core had disintegrated. When they did, they then decided to still keep it a secret while they tried to work out how they were going to contain it. But as you all know, I think it was Sweden who had a worker who alerted the International Atomic Energy that they'd had one of their alarms go off, but it wasn't them. And Moscow then had to come clean. But the other indirect casualty of this was the social issues. So there was a high number of suicide and violent deaths among firemen, policemen and other recovery workers because of the nature of what they'd actually had to do. Some people actually did what they did knowing that they would not survive. So the people who went in to let out the plug from the water container underneath the reactor knew that they probably would never survive it. And those people that ran onto the roof. So this was about heroism, and Kate Brown talks about this in her book. Areas still impacted today are the obvious ones. It's still in the soil. So if they plough the fields, it raises the radiation level. It's in the groundwater, it's in the food. And of course, the economic situation in Belarus means that they have to eat what they grow because they can't import massive amounts of food. Because they've lost so much agricultural land, they've actually, to be fair, tried to reinvent themselves economically, and they do quite a bit of technology now, and they make plastics and things like that, so things that aren't affected by the radiation. So what's the next threat? I know I'm just going to go on to the sarcophagus, which we know is the main threat, but just outside the Chernobyl disaster zone, there is the Red Forest. Now, the Red Forest was this 10 square kilometres of forest that was decimated at the time of the explosion. It turned the whole forest red. And the leaves all fell off the trees and they all lie on the ground, and they are still there because what's happened is the microorganisms that would have converted these leaves to soil have vanished, they've gone. So nothing is decaying in this area. So the fear is that if ever this set fire, this would release another cloud. So there is work ongoing to try to contain this or mitigate this risk. In the area as well, though, there's some positives because there are a lot of scientists doing a lot of research about what's happening in this area, about the microorganisms and about the mutations that have appeared. And they're doing a lot of medical research there, which may benefit us all as we, move forward. So we've got the new sarcophagus. as you know, the sarcophagus that was built over it was purely just to contain the fire and to contain the gamma rays that were coming out. So to actually try to keep the radiation confined, but no thought was given to how long it would last. They just covered it with concrete. However, as you all know, it's been crumbling for years. So the world decided that a second sarcophagus would have to be built over the reactor. It's cost 2.15 billion. It was constructed by engineers from all over the world. It weighs over 20,000 tons. It had to be built close to the reactor because of the fact that it had to be got over the reactor, and nobody can work above the reactor because gamma rays are still being emitted from the reactor. So the scientists had to work out at in what direction the gamma rays were going, so that they could work out how far away they could safely build this structure. This structure is 108 meters tall, 190 meters wide, and 200 meters in length. It took 7 years to build, and then they had to move it over the existing sarcophagus. And to do that, they devised a method of pistons, which actually pushed it over. But it had to be big enough to go over the old sarcophagus, but at the same time, close itself once it was over. And they devised a way of what effectively were cat flaps. So it went over, and as it went over, the cat flaps shut, and then they sealed them with lead. Inside, there is a machine now that is taking apart the actual core, what's called the elephant's foot, all the melted plutonium, which we don't know where it all's gone, probably into the ground, but there is quite a lot still there. So there is a machine that is in there taking that apart and putting it into containers. The problem we have is that nobody's worked out where it's going to go at the moment. However, science, as always, is coming to the fore, and they are working on ways of how we can decommission radioactive material by getting it to decompose. How far we will get with that, I don't really know. But that's our one remaining big problem, as we all know. Still today, it's being played down. So this was a scientist who came on air who said that following Fukushima, the people in Okuma, the village which was abandoned, was completely safe, and she actually walked down the road and said she would take her family to live there. Unfortunately, the calculations were wrong, and the World Health Organization had to withdraw that statement to say how the maths had and the calculation were wrong, and that it is highly contaminated. In another documentary, Thomas said there are only 122 deaths attributed to Chernobyl. But the European Environment Agency has said this is untrue. It could be estimated between 17,000 and 68,000. Kofi Annan, when he was Secretary General, said it's likely to run into millions. On Breakfast TV in 2019, I had a shock when Dr. Claire Cothill stated that in 70 years there'd only been 3 similar accidents to Chernobyl. But since Chernobyl, which was 34 years ago, there's been 57 nuclear accidents, and there's been more than 100 serious nuclear accidents. Hunterstone B in Scotland has been shut down for 6 months pending repairs to 400 cracks. We've got 15 reactors at 7 plants, and we've also got a nuclear reprocessing plant at Sellafield. So, Chernobyl children. In 25 years, we brought nearly 600 children to Kimber and the local area. That's Wombourne, Wolverhampton, Kings Swinford, Halesowen, Stourbridge. Of course, we didn't bring any this year because of COVID, so it was very, very sad. Many of the children interpreters still keep in touch. We collect aid because we're a voluntary organisation, so we collect aid all year. This is Colonel
Here's
Andre.
what I found.
Colonel Andre Misko. I was very lucky to meet him this year. He was one of the helicopter pilots that flew over Chernobyl. He was 26 when, in the first picture, when he actually went to Chernobyl. And he told the story. After 5 years, he started to suffer radiation issues, and he was decommissioned 9 years later. But he tells the story of how they went there, they were ordered to go to Chernobyl, they slept in tents 11 kilometres away, they had to fly their helicopters. Each flight counted for one roentgen, which is a measure of radiation, and in total they could only receive 25 reagents. Now, the problem they had was that they had Geiger counters that were reading 2 and 3 times that, and they had to record it when they were back at base. He said they were young, they trained for years to become pilots, and they realised that if they got to the 25 reagents, then their career would have been over. They would not have been able to fly again. So they all lied. And he said, whilst they regret it now, at the time, it didn't seem that much of a problem. Of the 200,000 people that were classed as liquidators there, you know, many of them now, a lot of them have died, and many of them are disabled. Nearly all of the ground staff, he said, that were there, that were loading the helicopters with the lead and the cement, have all died. So it was an honour to meet him, and I was very proud to have been there. These are another 2 lads that I bought last year. They developed bone cancer, aged 12 and 13. I was going to bring them again this year. I was going to raise the money to bring them with the other 20 children or 15 children. But unfortunately, COVID stopped that. But the one on the left, unfortunately, his bone graft gave way, and he was left in Belarus in the current political climate in plaster for nearly a month, because the only place the operation could be done, it can't be done in Belarus. They can't have these sort of bone graft operations in Belarus. They don't have the technology. He needed to go back to Italy, and Italy wouldn't take him with the current political problems that were there unless the money was given in advance. Luckily, a Polish charity stepped in, and he was able to have his leg repaired. Luckily, it wasn't anything sinister, which was my biggest fear. But what it was he'd had 2 plates inserted on the bone graft, and the weakness between the 2 plates gave way. So he's had to have a new plate, but he's back home and he's now recovering well. Of course, we've got another still tragedy going on there. Lukashenko's the last Western dictator. He's been accused of rigging the August election for a 6th term. Everybody, the opposition leaders are expelled or arrested. As you can see, over 3 dead, 7,000 arrested. They feel their struggle goes on. They feel they were the world's guinea pigs for Chernobyl, and now they've got another problem. They're just out on the streets every day, have been since August. Hundreds of thousands of people just walking and walking. Thank you for listening. Hope it's been interesting. Unfortunately, I could have talked all night and probably bored you to death, but I hope it's been interesting. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for that. And that was really, really interesting. It's quite a lot of hard to really properly understand the weight of some of those stories without being there to experience them themselves. So it's really interesting stuff. I think probably there's going to be a few people that would quite like a break to get just pop to the loo or grab a cup of tea. So what we'll do is we'll have a quick break for say 12 minutes, and at 8:30 we'll come back and there'll be a chance to ask Anne some questions. So just drop your questions in the Zoom comments box, or if you're watching on YouTube, put them in the chat. I'll see them and we'll have a little bit more of a discussion. So thanks very much, Anne. Thanks for everyone for coming, and we'll see you again in 12 minutes time.
Did you hear that, love? Yeah, but interesting. Yeah, I thought it might be. I turned some down. This woman's also trying to restore some in the wetland.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice little break. I know I certainly did. Anne, thank you so much again for coming along. I think we've got a few questions coming in for you, if you were happy to take a few.
Yeah, pleasure.
You hearing me okay?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Am I hearing you okay?
Are you?
I'm not hearing you.
I'm not muted.
Hold on 1 second. Say again, Anne. Are you coming through?
Yep, I've got you. I can hear you.
Can anyone else hear me? Is there anyone here that can hear what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm fine. I can hear you.
I can't hear John.
No, it's definitely me. All right. I apologize, everyone. Just 1 second.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Yep.
I can hear you.
Can you hear me, Linda?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Only you then, Ben. Technology is great, isn't it?
Yeah, when it works.
That's a great talk, Anne. Thank you.
Oh, I hope so, Linda. It's very nerve-wracking, isn't it? Especially when you're not an academic expert, really. You're just giving 26 years of passion. It's been my life, really. My kids have known nothing else. I've worked full time and raised 2 kids, but they have lived Chernobyl. They've had kids at home because we've always had 2 or 4 in our house for a month every year. So it's been really strange this year, really, really strange. Sad. I found it very hard, actually, to, amongst everything else, but it was a small thing in the way people are suffering, aren't they? Can you hear me, Ben?
There we go. Sorry about that, everyone. I had some sound issues on my end. And unfortunately, due to having to rejoin, I have lost all the questions that were in the chat. So could I ask somebody else that was through the meeting to just read out a couple of questions? I think the first one was from Victoria Simpson.
Yeah.
I can try and share mine now if you want. There's just a bit of background music where I am.
That would be lovely. If you speak up a bit, though, you're quite quiet.
1 second, sorry. Yeah, I was wondering if at the moment, obviously, because we're in a pandemic, so travel isn't a thing. I'm guessing you won't have been able to go out and see the children for quite a long time. And I was wondering kind of what's happening with them at the moment, and if COVID is particularly of a concern there, because they will be mostly leukemia affected children, I imagine, who are immunocompromised. So it will be of greater concern to them than it might be to most of us.
Yeah, I was just saying to Linda, it's been horrendous this year not to bring the children. I've got 2 boys, and the youngest was 4 when we first bought our first Chernobyl children. So in my house, they've known nothing else in July and August but Chernobyl children. But they've made lots of friends. So this year's been really strange because we haven't been able to bring them at all. 2 reasons. One was COVID, obviously, and the other one was of course, the Lukashenko problem. So there's very little travel in and out. They haven't suffered with COVID as bad as we did, but of course they don't have the travel in and out. Not many people really want to go to the Ukraine or Belarus, although Ukraine better because the Ukraine isn't so contaminated. It's only around the exclusion site really that the Ukraine is contaminated. It's Belarus that's really contaminated. So Belarus hasn't been quite, they have had COVID, they were very concerned initially, but they haven't had the cases. So COVID hasn't stopped them coming from that point of view, but it did obviously because they thought we were all dying in the UK, because they did get that information that we were badly affected, but they haven't been able to come as well because of the political situation. So we're hoping it's all going to settle down by next year.
Interesting, thank you.
Thank you.
Linda, did you get to ask your question? I see that you're next.
No, I saw a programme, it was a Horizon quite a few years back.
Yeah.
And it said that they haven't seen as many mutations in the wild population, in wildlife, as many as they thought.
Yeah.
So it was actually presented as though it wasn't quite as bad a problem as they thought it would be.
Yeah, there was another documentary that sort of contradicted that. I think it was Panorama. However, I think it's true what Horizon said in a way, that there weren't as, I think people did expect to find deer with two heads, and because we knew what effect it had had on humans, so we were expecting the effect on wildlife. In the Red Forest particularly, they have been, as I said, there's a lot of medical research going on. I think the Panorama documentary was more about that, about the fact that these microorganisms all died, they were all wiped out. So these leaves have never decayed. There's no decay in the Red Forest. It's just as it was. But they did find that they were trapping like field mice and voles, and then they were monitoring those, and they'd all got massive DNA changes. Which that from a medical point of view, that's very important as they research. They also found that barn swallows have got large amounts of cataracts and things like that. So I think you're right. I think and there's an argument both sides, and you'll always get people who argue that there was no fallout. You know, it's all been embroidered. But I was just reading something here that I didn't say, and there was a European Committee on Radiation Risk held a conference in Greece in 2009, because obviously these conferences are still going on because they're still monitoring the effects from that radiation, because it isn't only affecting Belarus, it's affecting us all. Yeah. And their findings were that their research, they said research indicated 1 million children may have died in the womb as a result across Europe and Asia alone, as well as hundreds of thousands of adults were exposed to the fallout. And I think that goes to show how much it was. And that correlates, of course, to this piece of work, this piece of research that was done about those stillbirths down in Wales and that, which was quite startling, really. But, you know, it's frightening stuff, isn't it? That in some ways we don't want to know, because it is a bit scary, really.
I don't think the powers that be want us to know in a sense.
No, but as I said, Linda, the problem is every fourth time you turn your kettle on in the UK, it's powered by nuclear. What do we do? What is the alternative? You know, it would be lovely if we had an alternative source, wouldn't it? But we haven't. We're building new ones, aren't we? Unfortunately.
When I was an apprentice, fast reactor, which converted uranium to plutonium. I don't know what to do with it now, if they reprocessed it there at one time. I know it was coming through Bestcott Rail Depot, Walsall.
Yes, I remember that, John. I remember that.
The second one I worked on was wind scale.
Yeah.
Now, wind scale had the design falls when the grab, which was a 3-clawed job, took the radioactive uranium rods out the core.
Yeah.
It traversed the gas duct, which took the stuff out through the chimney, and it dropped 2 radioactive uranium rods in the gas duct, and they couldn't shut the plant down, of course, because it takes years to deactivate it. So we quickly had to rig up some contraption in angle iron with boron corrugated sheeting on top to absorb radiation. Well, remember the government put it out that the radiation drifted out over the sea. Well, as it was on the Cumbrian coast, people assumed it was over the Irish Sea. It drifted out over the North Sea, across the north of England to do it. And all the milk and sheep were contaminated with strontium-90, I remember.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's still restrictions up there, because I know
as I say, in the talk, there are 3. If you Google it, there are 370 farms where we still can't take any produce from. And it could be that they aren't all Chernobyl, as you say, that some of them are our own our own
I
mistakes.
think there's still a higher cancer rate around the Sellafield area.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
Because we got a friend that's moved up there.
Yeah.
Don't know why.
You were
But of course, there
mentioning
is a tourism thing now where people are going to see actually the reactor, aren't they?
Reactor, they are, yeah.
You know, you will always get people doing these things, really.
Yeah.
I've only been to Belarus twice. Once to cure myself after about 10 years, because my husband thought I was mad. And so I went for 2 weeks. And when I came back, I was worse.
Yeah.
So then he went. Yeah. And then when he came back, he was worse. When you go out there, they are such lovely people as well. Yeah. And they are so grateful for what we do.
Yeah, and afterwards, if you recall, they changed the name of Windscale to Sellafield because it was the Windscale reactor when we built it.
Yes.
Sellafield sometime after the leak.
Yeah. So they wanted to hide it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It was,
let's rename it.
Channel. Yeah.
You were talking earlier about the effects on the wildlife. One thing that in my profession that has occurred since the 80s is cases of what we call hyperthyroidism in cats, where they produce excessive thyroid hormone. When I first graduated and before when I was a student, the disease wasn't even mentioned in my clinical notes, and it started arising fairly soon, along with a number of other diseases in the 80s. And the cases still occur today. It's a benign cancer of the thyroid glands. So fortunately, it doesn't kill the cats, but excess thyroid hormone isn't good for you. Fortunately, it can be treated. But I think that is, my feeling is it's due to Chernobyl, but nobody's ever...
Alan, in Kate Brown's book, she talks about the history of radiation. And as she said, the world was quite polluted with quite a bit of radiation from Easter Island, from Atoll, from all the testing that we did. So where we've got background radiation that we get normally in the ground, and we get it from sun, obviously, but we get it from the ground as well, don't we? Particularly in Cornwall. That has been added to by all these, the pollutants that came from all this atomic testing. And then, of course, Chernobyl came on top, and then Fukushima. And so she said, we are continually radiating ourselves, really. But, you know, then... I don't know what's the answer. Is we haven't got an answer to it, have we? Really?
What we have on the fish and things like that. You know, we will. Sinnos in Greece was quite a contaminated area, and obviously the Scandinavian countries. But there would have been fallout into the sea as well.
Yeah.
Fish and so on. Yeah. We eat a lot of that sort of fish, don't we? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had a cousin who was stationed in the RAF, and they posted him to Christmas Island.
Yeah.
And during the nuclear tests in the Pacific, they made them line up on the edge of the cliff, facing the nuclear tests. Now, later on in life, he developed epilepsy, and he died of an epileptic fit in the night on one he had. But we never know whether the epilepsy was due to any contamination at all he'd received when he was in that sort of situation.
Well, that's what I referred to in the talk about, that a lot of those testing people have made claims against the government for exposure during those tests, really. And that's what they're frightened of. How, and there would have been a lot of people, wouldn't there?
Yeah. And
it's been some time ago now, so.
Yeah, it did a long time ago. Yeah.
I mean, just going back to that colonel that you saw the picture of, he gets £13 a month, and he's 59. He considers himself lucky to be alive. Of the 200,000 people that were classed as high risk liquidators, 85,000 are severely disabled, and over 20,000 have died. So he considers himself lucky to be alive, really.
Changed from a communist state to a mafia state, hasn't it?
Well, it has in both. Well, we've got the Ukraine, haven't we? I mean, Lithuania, and all those countries.
They're threatened.
Yeah. Well, they've all come out of the USSR quite well, really. But the Ukraine, who thought they'd done well, of course, he got poisoned, didn't he? And then subsequently they marched in. And then, of course, we've got Putin as he is. And then, of course, Belarus now with the last Western dictator.
Yeah.
But where that's going to end, I don't know.
Belarus used to be White Russia.
It was part of White Russia, yeah.
White Russia, yeah.
But I mean, they don't want anything to do with Russia, really.
No.
You know, they are just stuck
Russia
now.
want them back, don't they, really? You know.
Well, Russia would like them back. They're right on their border, aren't they?
The empire.
But whether he would do it or not, I don't know. Who's to say? But that's another reason we can't move children at the moment, isn't it? Because, you know, they're not. Well, there's no border. You're frightened to go in. I've got friends who want to go, and they're frightened to go because they've really got the borders closed down at the moment.
I was wondering, Anne, a lot of people at the moment are living in the sort of Chernobyl exclusion zone and, you know, the area around Pripyat. What are their sort of takes on life? You mentioned earlier that there's a lot of elderly people that are living there that haven't moved away even despite the crisis. So I'm sure you probably met some of these people. How do they see it?
Well, Pripyat isn't occupied at all. There is a 30-mile exclusion zone. You can go into it. You have to get a special permit. And you're only allowed in for so long. But in the forests further away, older people, like in their 80s, had to give up their home where they'd lived all their lives. So some of those had gone back. There was a documentary, The Babushkas of Chernobyl, that documented their lives. They'd gone back. There was about 7 in a community, about 15 minutes walk from each other, 20 minutes walk, no electric, no shops, no water. They had to use a well, they had to go to a stream. That's how they're still living in those, because there's no infrastructure. And Belarus itself has, over the years, when I first went 20 odd years ago, it was like just stepping back in time. It was so old communist blocks, people wonderful, so welcoming, so generous. And the hospitals where I went, just like stepping back in time. But now they've got more, like, Russian money's poured in. They've got a lot of Chinese money poured in. So you've got a new sort of culture. So Minsk itself is beautiful. It's a lovely city. And they've got a lot of what we would call the nice things of the West. But of course, a lot of Belarusians can't afford it. So the average Belarusian struggles on, most of them have got 2 jobs. Most of the doctors I know have got 2 jobs. And, you can't imagine that, can you? They're finished being a doctor in the day and they go and do another job. And that still applies today, really. They don't have what we have, but they're never envious. And Shirley Tart, she used to write for the Express and Star, and she had 2 children a long time ago. And she wrote something that I found that was absolutely fascinating. And she said, when these 2 children came to stay with us, we were going to teach them so much about life. And she said, when they went back, we realised that they taught us more. And she thought what they really taught us was they take what they need, not what they want. And that's very true about the Belarusians. They have a settee and it's lasted them 50 years. They don't have a new one because they want a different colour. And they're only just starting to go on foreign holidays. They are just starting to be able to get out to the Ukraine or get out to Lithuania or Poland. Whereas before, foreign travel, only 7 or 8 years ago was almost impossible for them. They just don't have the money. They haven't got the economy because nearly all of their wealth goes on healthcare. So, but they haven't got the healthcare either. I mean, if you go into a hospital, you have to pay for your own bandages, plasters, or take them with you. And those operations for those 2 youngsters that I had last year couldn't be done in Belarus. They told me, they said we could have had them done in Belarus, but my arm and my leg would never have walked or worked. So they even know themselves, they knew that they had to be got out to a different country to have, and And I look after several lads personally who've got mainly lads, I have to say, because I've got 2 boys, you see. I had them when they were very young. One of them's got Hodgkin's lymphoma, and one of them's got thyroid cancer.
Yeah.
And they have their treatment outside of Belarus. One goes to Germany and the other one goes to Italy. So Europe's been very good, really, to Belarus and Ireland. So they've been very good to them. They've had a lot of support in lots of ways, because I think people thought it was an accident. It wasn't something they did to themselves, really. They got done to, especially when you hear that about seeding the clouds. I just didn't believe that people could do that. I just didn't think it was possible. But yeah, they did.
I know you can seed them with dry ice to create rain, drop the temperature of the cloud to condense the water out. That was a practice that used to be done in America at times.
I know, John, I couldn't believe it when I read it. I just thought, well, I can't believe. And then to do it, to rain on people unknowingly, and you were going to drop radiation poison on them, that just shows how the Russian state were, didn't it, really? Yeah. Well, we don't want it on Moscow, so let's send it to Belarus. Mind you, having said that, as it fell on Belarus, it was less that went on to Europe, which was part of their strategy, of course, because the more damage they did to Europe, the worse it would have been. They had control of Belarus. They had control of the information that went in and out. Kate Brown makes that clear in her book, that, you know, all information. So a good example, Lindy, it's Victoria asked me about COVID. The doctors telling me that they were told they couldn't put COVID on any death certificate in Belarus. They had to put pneumonia. So then they had a brief to say, too many pneumonia cases, you'll have to put bronchitis. And that's how Belarus operates. Not good news. Bury the bad news. Let's have, we'll change that. Let's record something else. And Kate Brown makes that clear in her book about how that was rife across the Soviet Union, and how that's why we'll never know. That's what all these reports say. We will never know how many people were affected by Chernobyl.
Gosh, that's very interesting. Does anyone else have any questions for Anne this evening?
Ben's time, isn't it?
Oh, one more question. Obviously, Chernobyl is increasingly becoming a tourist spot with tours opening. I haven't been myself, but I imagine it's something monopolised by a few different tour companies. What impact has this had upon the area, if you've seen any? That's from Victoria again.
Well, with regard to where they go, there's very little impact really, because it's in the Ukraine. They go to the Chernobyl nuclear site. They go on an organised tour. They are only allowed so many hours there. They get to see the reactor building and they come back out. So the effect would be the Ukraine needs all the support it can get in terms of tourism. As I say, that's another reason they weren't badly affected by COVID, because there isn't a lot of tourism. Lots of people don't go to Belarus, and lots of people don't, well, other than Kiev, which is quite popular, but it's not contaminated Kiev. I mean, I can understand that there are all these people that go to these disaster sites, aren't there? There have been a few who've gone to, he does a documentary on television, isn't there? He does go into wild places or something, and he went as well, and they took the Geiger counter with them, and Geiger counted everywhere they went, and it was quite shocking, really. Mm-hmm. So if you're young and you're fine, well, fine. I don't think I'll be going. Not to the reactor anyway.
You come back not so young and quite not so fine.
Right, thank you so much, Anne. It's been absolutely terrific to have you on. I've learned so much this evening, honestly. It's one of the favourite talks I've certainly listened to here in a long time. Absolute pleasure to have you, and thank you everyone else for coming. This time next month, I think we have our very own Linda, is it right? Giving a talk. What are you talking about next month, Linda?
Whale of a Time.
Whale of a Time.
So
very interesting.
Various places I've seen whales and a bit about them as well.
Oh, absolutely wonderful. So yeah, we should all look forward to that. Stay tuned on our Facebook page for any more announcements. And until then, stay safe, everyone. Take care, and
And
see
thank
you
you all
next
very
time.
much indeed. It was lovely to
Thank
meet
you
you.
very much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
All right,
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
thank you very much.
Thank
Bye bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. We'll leave.